You ever walk away from a conversation feeling like you said everything, and still lost, like your words just disappeared into the noise, and somehow, despite trying to stay calm and clear, you ended up feeling small, like your strength got buried under someone else's volume? Maybe you've been told that staying quiet makes you weak, that if you don't speak up, you're letting people walk all over you, so you explain more, defend harder, and still feel unheard. But what if silence isn't weakness? What if it's the highest form of control? The Stoics believed real strength isn't about reacting, it's about restraint. The ones who say less often see more. And when your silence comes from self-mastery, it becomes power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that shifts the entire room if that's something you feel deep down. And if you value the kind of conversations we have here, do me one simple favor, hit that subscribe button. It helps more than, you know? Now, let's get into it. You don't gain the upper hand by reacting. That's where most people go wrong. They assume the fastest reply or the cleverest comeback wins the game. But that's just surface noise. True intelligence doesn't rush into the spotlight. It steps back, takes a breath, and watches everything unfold. Outsmarting someone isn't about volume or speed, it's about perspective. It's seeing the whole board clearly while others are too busy focusing on their next move. You give them space to talk, to reveal, to stretch themselves. Thin, all the while you remain still. Not passive, but precise. That stillness isn't emptiness. It's loaded with intention. It's the discipline to hold your fire. It's the kind of quiet that carries weight, because it doesn't need to prove anything to be powerful. This works, because silence, when grounded in strength, unsettles people more than any argument ever could in a world addicted to noise. Silence feels like something's missing, like something must be wrong. Many see it as a weakness, a void, or even surrender. But in reality, silence is often the strongest stance a person can take. It doesn't chase control. It is control. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's the quiet power of silence. It brings what's hidden to the surface, while others try to figure you out. They begin to unravel in trying to read your stillness. They reveal more than they intend: their fears, their insecurities, their true intentions. And the more they speak, the clearer their inner world becomes. People tend to talk the most when they feel the most uncertain in conflict. They ramble, repeat themselves, and offer explanations no one asked for, not because they're confident, but because they're afraid. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being exposed, afraid of what might surface if the talking stopped. The noise becomes a shield, a way to cover something fragile underneath. It's not always self-expression, it's self-protection. Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And that's exactly what many avoid without reflection, without real clarity. They rely on words to fill the gap, not to reveal the truth, but to hide the fact that they don't fully know it themselves. There's a quiet irony in the way people behave. Under pressure, the louder they get, the more you see what they're trying to hide. It shows up in those moments when someone can't stop talking, can't stop explaining. They aren't trying to convince you. They're trying to convince themselves. The uncertainty inside leaks out through every word. Plato captured it perfectly. Wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something. And in any room, that difference is easy to feel. One person stands firm, grounded, unshaken. The other floats, grasping for certainty, for control, for approval they can't quite get. But when you don't give them anything back, when you stay composed, quiet, unfazed, something shifts without your resistance. They lose their anchor. They begin to unravel. Not because you're doing anything, but because you're doing nothing. Your stillness becomes a pressure of its own. They start talking more louder, faster, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence that now surrounds them, but the silence doesn't go away. It reflects everything they're trying to bury, and that's what shakes them most, because silence doesn't lie. It doesn't give them a script to follow or a distraction to hide behind. It just shows them themselves. That's what people really fear about silence. It's not the absence of noise. It's the presence of truth. Not the kind they polish or perform, but the kind that simply exists. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But knowing yourself means slowing down, being still, and letting the noise fade. And for many, that's unbearable, because when the distractions stop, they're left with thoughts they've avoided for years. So they talk, they argue, they deflect, not to reach you, but to escape themselves. To outsmart someone, the first thing you do is take control by refusing to play by their rules. Most people aren't looking for understanding when they argue, they're looking for dominance. They don't bring up an issue to resolve it. They bring it up to provoke you, to get you off balance, to see if they can steer the emotional temperature of the room. It's not about truth, it's about control. And the tool they use most often is reaction. They push buttons, they poke at your insecurities, they dangle guilt, frustration, or ego in front of you, like bait, and if you bite, if you respond with emotion, you give them the map, you show them where you're vulnerable. Reaction becomes data. It's no longer just energy, it's ammunition. Once they know where you'll flinch, they don't stop. They test those spots again, they lean into them. Each reaction you give reinforces their sense of control. This is how manipulation works. It's subtle. It doesn't always come with raised voices. Sometimes it's wrapped in concern and charm, in carefully placed words designed to pull you out of your center. But the moment you respond impulsively, you've stepped onto their field. So what happens when you don't? What happens when you remain still? Not just in your words, but in your inner state, no flare of anger, no need to explain or defend, just calm, steady presence. That's when everything shifts. You're no longer the one being observed. They are. You stop offering feedback, and suddenly they're the one unsure. They start feeling the silence, grasping for control that's quietly slipping from their hands. What felt like certainty for them starts turning into doubt, because without your reaction, they're left with themselves. No mirror, no friction, no clear path forward. That's when the game breaks. Their strategy was built on the assumption that you'd play along, that you'd argue back, defend yourself, try to correct them. But when none of that happens, their footing slips. You didn't just remove your words. You removed the structure they were leaning on, and they're left scrambling, unaware that they lost the moment you refuse to engage on their terms. Silence is unsettling to those who rely on control. It strips away their usual tactics. It doesn't give them feedback cues or a script to follow when someone can't predict you. They feel vulnerable not because you've done anything threatening, but because their sense of control is slipping. We fear what we can't define, and silence, especially when it's calm and intentional, becomes impossible to read. That's where the discomfort begins. When someone talks, they reveal their thoughts. But when someone simply watches, when they offer no reaction, no resistance, they stop being a participant and start being a mirror, and most people aren't ready to face what that reflection shows them. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Silence brings that irritation to the surface. It's raw, unfiltered, and it doesn't let them hide behind a story without the buffer of your reaction. They're forced to confront themselves, their tone, their motives, their contradictions. And in that space where they expect a push but get nothing at all, they start to expose more than they ever meant to. It's in that silence, ironically, that people speak the loudest, not through what they say, but through how they say it. You hear it in the over-explaining, the repetition, the rising urgency in their voice. That's not clarity, it's insecurity. Trying to sound confident, and the harder someone tries to convince you, the more they reveal they're not fully convinced themselves. Plato once said, "Truth is the beginning of every good thing." And truth doesn't perform, it doesn't try to persuade. It simply stands calm and quiet, needing no applause. As you sit in silence and truly observe, you start picking up on what they're trying to cover. You notice the mismatch between their words and their energy. You hear the forced conviction. You see how their confidence falters the moment there's no one pushing back. And that's when everything becomes clear. Not just what they're saying, but what they're protecting, the fragile ego behind. The firm stance, the doubt behind the confidence, the fear behind the force. That's why the most powerful people in the room often say the least. They aren't there to win attention or dominate a conversation. They are there to see clearly. They listen, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. They read posture, tone, and tension, and in doing so, they gain something far more valuable than a quick win. They gain insight. They spot the cracks. And while others keep talking, they collect everything. They need quietly, confidently, without saying a word. Why interrupt someone who's already revealing everything you need to know? When a person talks long enough, they hand you the truth unfiltered, unguarded, without realizing it. Socrates once said, "I know that I am intelligent because I know that I know nothing." That's not weakness, that's strength disguised as humility. It's the kind of awareness that steps back, watches, listens, and lets others show their hand. And while they think they're playing the game, they don't notice they've already become the subject of it because you're not in the match. They are. You're just watching. There's a different kind of power that comes when you stop reacting. Not passivity, not avoidance, but a steady, patient clarity that allows you to see things others miss. When silence is no longer the absence of voice, but the presence of awareness. Everything shifts. You stop trying to win arguments and start reading them. You stop trying to explain and begin to understand. The less you need to speak, the more you start hearing. The truth isn't always found in what's said, but in what someone feels compelled to say. And when you give someone space, when you let them unravel without interruption, they often reveal more than they ever intended. Silence, when it's rooted in confidence, doesn't make you invisible. It makes you undeniable. You're not hiding. You're not shrinking. You're standing so still, so solid that your presence starts speaking for itself. And real control doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to be flashy. It doesn't announce itself to the room. It simply exists, and the room feels it. Carl Jung captured this when he said, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakes." That inner awareness, that unshakable calm becomes a shield nothing can penetrate, because once your strength comes from within, there's nothing external that can take it away. Think of the person who remains calm in a heated exchange, not because they're suppressing something, but because they've mastered it. They're centered, steady, fully present. The energy in the room bends toward them without effort. The louder voice starts to lose its footing. The aggressive stance begins to tremble because the pattern they're used to push, provoke, argue suddenly stops working. And in that stillness, their words begin to echo back. They start hearing themselves without your interference. And often what they hear isn't impressive. It's fragile. That's the moment when silence becomes more than just stillness. It becomes a kind of mirror, and most people don't like what they see when it's held up to them without distortion. Plato once said, "The greatest wealth is to live content with little." But in conflict, most people aren't content with less. They want reaction. They crave resistance. It gives them a sense of identity, something to push against. But when that resistance doesn't come, when your face doesn't flinch and your words don't arrive, they're left facing the one thing they've been running from themselves, and that's where your power is not in overpowering them, not in having the last word, but in letting silence do the work. It strips away the performance, the defense, the noise, and reveals the truth, not just about them, but about you, that you don't need to defend what's already solid, that you don't need to respond to. Stay in control, because real control isn't loud, it's quiet and it's unshakable, but silence on its own isn't always strength. It can just as easily become avoidance if it isn't grounded in clarity. If you stay quiet because you're afraid to speak, or because you've convinced yourself your voice doesn't carry weight, that's not control, it's self-abandonment. True silence, the kind that commands presence, comes from knowing exactly why you're choosing not to speak. Aristotle put it simply, knowing. Yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And that self-knowledge is what separates strategic silence from passive silence. The first is a choice, the second is a retreat. One holds power, the other leaks it. The silence we're talking about isn't silence out of fear. It's the kind rooted in discipline, the stillness before a move that shifts the entire game, the pause between stimulus and response that makes what comes next carry real weight. It's not about withholding, it's about wielding. And the moment you can pause when every part of you wants to react, you flip the entire dynamic. You stop being the one pushed around by someone else's emotions, and you become the gravitational center of the interaction. When you stop reacting, you change the rhythm you take, the predictability out of the exchange. That alone causes a shift. The one who was loud, certain, demanding, now they're second-guessing themselves. The confidence turns shaky. The volume starts to mask uncertainty because people expect a reaction they're used to triggering one, and when it doesn't come, they don't know what to do. That's the real disruption, not the silence itself, but the unpredictability it introduces. And unpredictability has always carried power. It unsettles people. It strips away their certainty and replaces it with doubt. The human mind, when faced with uncertainty, begins to imagine scenarios. It fills the gaps with projection, insecurity, and fear. Socrates once said, "I cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them think." Strategic silence forces thought. It pushes people inward, not to examine you, but but to examine themselves, their approach, their reasoning, their motives. And once someone starts looking inward in the middle of a conflict, the power they once felt begins to dissolve. This is what makes silence so effective when used with intention. It's not about proving a point. It's about letting the space between words reveal what no explanation ever could. So when you find yourself in a moment where someone is pressing you to react, to defend, to prove yourself, pause. You don't need to give them what they're looking for. Because often the most powerful move is to let them show their hand while you show nothing at all, not because you have nothing to say, but because you already know your silence says everything. People aren't truly shaken by loud voices. They're shaken by what they can't read. Mystery unnerves them far more than noise ever could. It lingers in the air, creates tension, and forces the imagination into overdrive. That's the quiet advantage of someone who doesn't reveal too much. When people can't figure you out, when they can't predict how you'll respond, they feel out of control, and control is what most people are secretly trying to hold on to in every conversation. If they don't know where you stand, they don't know how to prepare for you. If they can't prepare, they can't manipulate, and that makes you dangerous, not because you're loud or aggressive, but because you remain unreadable long enough for them to lose their script. There's nothing harder to influence than someone who keeps their emotional center intact, someone who doesn't blurt out every opinion, who doesn't wear their reactions on their sleeve. That kind of presence confuses people. It's like staring at a blank screen. They start projecting their own thoughts, fears, and assumptions onto you. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what happens when one of those substances remains neutral, when one person refuses to react, stays grounded, just watches the other becomes exposed, not because they were challenged, but because they were left to reveal themselves, and in that subtle exchange, it's the quiet one who holds the power. The wisest people in the room often say the least, and that's not because they're quiet by nature. It's because they've already seen the outcome. They know that speaking too quickly can give away more than intended. Every word you offer is a piece of your internal map. What you think, what matters to you, what provokes you. The truly intelligent choose their moments." Plato captured this when he said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools, because they have to say something. The wise don't speak to be heard. They speak to make a move. Their words aren't reactive. They're intentional, calculated, timed. Not for impact alone, but for precision. There's a kind of quiet strategy in listening more than speaking, and letting others fill the air while you gather everything: energy, information, leverage. And when you finally do speak, it lands because the room knows you don't speak just to fill the silence. You speak to shift it. Treat your words like a weapon. Not one to be flashed for show, but one carried with discipline. A sword isn't drawn for every minor offense. It's reserved for moments that matter. Moments that require clarity, precision, and undeniable impact. That's how intelligent people use language, not as decoration, not for display, but as a tool of intention. They know the cost of careless speech. Every word can expose something, invite something, or reveal more than it should. So they choose their moments. Precision over performance, impact over impulse. They don't speak to prove, they speak to shape, because real power isn't about saying more. It's about saying just enough, and sometimes not saying anything at all. But silence by itself isn't what makes them powerful. It's what stands behind it. Silence without presence is just space, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, but silence backed by grounded presence. That's something else entirely. That's the kind of stillness that shifts the energy in a room. It unsettles not through aggression, but through sheer composure. You don't have to move a muscle or speak a word to change the atmosphere. You simply stand in who you are. No apology, no performance, and people around you start adjusting. Not because you made them, but because your presence made them feel they needed to. There's something unspoken that happens when a person walks into a room with real presence. It tells you everything before they say a single word. That quiet confidence, that centered stillness, it speaks volumes. It says, "I know who I am." It says, "I don't need to overpower this room. I am the room." When your energy communicates that, your silence becomes undeniable. It commands attention without asking for it. It shifts people's tone, their posture, even their arguments begin to soften, not out of submission, but out of awareness. They feel it. They sense that they're dealing with someone who doesn't need noise to be respected. Aristotle believed that character is revealed through action, not through words and presence. Is action without movement. It's a signal that you've done the internal work, that you're not shaken by noise, not baited by ego, not stirred by shallow challenges. That alone changes everything. Because once your presence carries weight, your voice doesn't need to. You don't have to talk over anyone. You don't have to defend yourself. People feel the boundary. You don't have to speak aloud. Presence has nothing to do with being loud or dominating the conversation. It's about the stillness inside you when everything around you demands a reaction. It's being so deeply rooted in your own identity that chaos can't uproot you. It's knowing your values, your principles, your line, and never needing to shout them to prove they exist. That kind of presence is magnetic. It doesn't pull people toward you. Through charm, it does it through certainty, through depth, through stability, and that kind of presence that speaks louder than any performance. Socrates once said, "Be as you wish to seem." That's what presence is. It's living in alignment with who you say you are. No contradictions, no mask, just quiet, consistent strength, the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that doesn't try to impress, the kind that is, and that presence, it speaks. Before you ever open your mouth, it shifts the room, not through force, but through the weight of your stillness. People can feel when you're not seeking validation, when you're no longer afraid of being misunderstood, when you're fully at peace with being exactly who you are. That kind of energy changes how others behave without you having to say a thing. They start to tread more carefully, not because you intimidated them, but because your calm exposes their noise. As Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you've reached that point, when your identity no longer hinges on being seen, accepted, or understood, your silence begins to speak louder than any defense ever could. And when you do speak, that's when everything shifts, because people know it's not filler, it's not an emotional outburst or an attempt to dominate. It's deliberate. The silence that comes before your words builds tension, real tension, and the silence that follows lets every word land deeper, echo longer. There's no need to speak over anyone when one quiet sentence holds more weight than 1,000 desperate ones. As Plato once said, "A wise man thinks all he says, but a fool says all he thinks." That's what presence gives you: the discipline to wait until it matters, and the power to make it count when it does. But how do you reach that level? How do you become the kind of person whose silence commands more than most people's speeches? You train yourself to sit in discomfort. You stop running from it and start using it as a sharpening stone. You learn to stay still when someone misjudges you, when they throw unfair labels, when they assume things you know aren't true. Your ego will want to fight back. It will scream for the last word, the correction, the need to be seen clearly, but real strength is found in resisting that scream. It's in choosing peace over performance. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." And when you truly know yourself, no one's misunderstanding can shake you. You don't need to chase clarity from others. You already have it within. That level of self-possession is rare. That's why it's so powerful, because once people realize they can't provoke you, that they can't drag you into their emotional maze, they lose control of the narrative. They can't play a game you refuse to join, and when you stop needing to defend yourself, when you let go of the urge to be understood, you become immune to manipulation. That's how manipulators work. They fish for reactions, they poke until they find an open wound. But if you don't react, they have nothing to work with you. Give them no blueprint, no access, no entry point, and that makes you untouchable. So the real question is, can you hold your ground in silence while the world tries to pull you into noise? Can you sit with being misread and still remain steady? Can you trust your truth enough to let it speak for itself, even when others can't hear it? Because in that silence lies your control, in that restraint lives the strength most people never find. It's in that stillness, that refusal to explain or defend, where your power fully emerges. Let go of the need to be right, the need to be seen, the need to be cleared of someone else's misunderstanding. That need is not power, it's dependency. It's your ego's plea for acceptance disguised as logic. But when you release that need, when you stop asking for permission to exist as you are, you step into something far more grounded. You become the kind of person who doesn't have to prove anything, because who you are already proves it. What do you put in place of that constant urge to react? You replace it with observation. Real focused attention. You let patience take the lead. You sit in stillness, not because you're frozen, but because you're thinking that kind of stillness isn't passive, it's tactical. It's what happens when you're watching the entire board unfold while everyone else is too busy chasing their next move. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The moment you stop reacting, you start tuning in, not just to what's happening, but to the why behind it. You begin to see the performance underneath the words. You start noticing who's speaking from truth and who's just trying to keep their mask from slipping. There's a pattern to it. The nervous energy hiding behind confidence, the repeated explanations, the constant need to be right, the passion that feels more like panic. You can hear the cracks in their voice, see the hesitation in their rhythm, feel the overcompensation in every word. Plato once said, "Truth is the beginning of every good thing, and truth doesn't shout. It doesn't over-explain it, doesn't try to convince you it's real, it just is." That's how you know when someone tries too hard to prove something. It's often because deep down they don't believe it themselves. So what do you do when you see it? Nothing. That's the power. You don't need to correct them. You don't need a cutting line or a brilliant comeback. You just hold the silence and let them unravel in it. Every word they speak becomes a reveal. Every attempt to hold control starts pointing directly to where they feel least secure. Their own noise does the work for you. All you have to do is give them the space to fill it, and they always do. That's when the argument falls apart. Not because you picked it apart, but because it couldn't hold itself up. You didn't engage, and still you won. How? By never playing the game in the first place. You don't outtalk people who want a reaction. You outweight them. You stay steady. You let the noise spin itself out until the truth stands alone. Their contradictions, their cracks, their insecurities, they surface naturally without you needing to say a single thing. That's how you outsmart someone. You let them reveal everything while you reveal nothing. But here's where people get it. Twisted silence alone isn't always power. If you're staying quiet out of fear because you think you don't matter, or because you've been taught to shrink, then that silence is just a cage. It doesn't protect you. It isolates you, and over time it turns into resentment, the kind that builds quietly until it breaks you down from the inside out. Powerful silence is a choice. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and deciding that you don't need to prove it. It's not rooted in fear. It's built on self-respect. Because when your silence comes from a place of strength, it doesn't suppress you. It elevates you. It becomes a calm that no storm can shake. But when it comes from fear, it steals your voice long before you ever get the chance to use it. And that kind of silence doesn't make you powerful. It makes you invisible. So if you're going to be quiet, make sure it's because you're choosing not to speak, not because you've forgotten you're allowed to. So how do you know the difference? How can you tell if your silence is a weapon or a cage? It's in the intention. If your silence feels like peace, grounded, alert, aware, then you're holding a weapon. If it feels like suffocation, like self, betrayal, like retreat, then you're hiding. Socrates said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." Silence used wisely builds. It strengthens your position. It gives you space to grow. But silence used to avoid becomes a prison in a world that never stops talking. Your silence can become your greatest statement. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to explain to be understood. Stand still, be calm, and let the world adjust to your presence if this spoke to something deep in you. There's another video waiting on the screen that will take this even further. Watch that next. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Your presence here means more than you know. And remember, true strength isn't in how loud you speak, but in how deeply you listen. We'll see you back here soon.